Imagine this: a 16-year-old girl goes for her usual morning jog, only to end up in handcuffs, thanks to a power-hungry HOA president, who decided she could dictate who belonged in her neighborhood. Linda Pierce was certain her authority was untouchable, that the police would blindly enforce her will, no matter how unjust. But what she didn't know, that girl's father was a federal judge, and he wasn't just going to fight back, he was going to end the HOA's reign for good. Just wait until you hear how this story unfolded and why the ones who once ruled with an iron fist are now the ones begging for mercy. Emma Carter had always loved the quiet solitude of her early morning runs. At 16, with the relentless pressures of school, college applications, and the towering expectations of her parents looming over her, running was her escape, a rare moment where she could breathe, where the only thing that mattered was the rhythmic sound of her feet against the pavement and the cool air filling her lungs. It was her sanctuary, her rebellion, her one slice of freedom in a life that often felt like an endless race she hadn't agreed to run. The neighborhood was still asleep as she jogged past manicured lawns and towering oak trees, her breath steady, her muscles warm and loose. The sky was shifting from deep navy to soft lavender, the sun not yet high enough to chase away the shadows stretching across the pavement. This was her favorite time of day. The world felt untouched, peaceful, until it wasn't. A sudden burst of red and blue lights slashed through the early morning haze, casting an eerie glow across the pristine sidewalks of Oak Ridge Estates. "Hands where I can see them." The command came sharp, cutting through the morning stillness like a whip. Emma skidded to a halt, her sneakers scraping against the asphalt, her chest rising and falling rapidly, but not from exertion. This was something else, something cold and electric, curling around her spine. Her hands shot up instinctively. What? She barely recognized her own voice. "I'm just running." "Quiet." Another barked order. A middle-aged officer emerged from behind the blinding lights, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the glow of the patrol car. His eyes raked over her, calculating, judgmental, like he was waiting for her to give him a reason. "Residents have complained about trespassing." Emma's pulse thundered in her ears. "This is a public road." She tried to keep her voice steady, but she could hear the waver, the creeping edge of panic lacing her words. Then she saw her. Linda Pierce, the president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, stood just behind the officers, arms crossed over her chest, a smug little smirk tugging at the corner of her overglossed lips. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction. "Not anymore," Linda purred, tilting her head slightly, as if she were delivering the punchline to a joke only she was in on. "The HOA has jurisdiction here, and we don't tolerate loiterers or suspicious behavior." The way she said it, the way her gaze flickered over Emma's running shorts and sweatshirt made Emma's stomach turn. She wasn't stupid, she knew exactly what this was. A storm of anger, disbelief, and something far uglier churned inside her, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to keep breathing. She had seen enough news stories, heard enough hushed conversations at dinner tables, to know how fast things could go from bad to worse. "I live 2 blocks away," she gritted out, jaw tight. "I run this route every morning. No one's ever had a problem before." Linda shrugged, unbothered. "There's always a first time for everything." Emma clenched her fists. Her skin felt hot, her throat tight, but she refused to let them see her break. "Turn around," the officer's voice was flat, almost bored, as if this were just another routine traffic stop. Her breath caught. "Are you serious?" Now a beat of silence stretched between them, the patrol car's engine hummed softly in the background, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. Then she felt it, the cold bite of steel snapping around her wrists. Emma sat on the cold, hard bench of the holding cell, arms wrapped around herself, trying to suppress the shivers running through her body. Whether it was from the sterile chill of the room or the sinking realization of where she was, she couldn't tell. The dim fluorescent light above flickered every few seconds, buzzing like a dying insect, casting eerie, jerky shadows across the gray cinderblock walls. The whole place smelled like old coffee, sweat, and that sharp, artificial sting of industrial-strength disinfectant. It was the kind of smell that never fully went away, no matter how much bleach was poured over the floors. It clung to the air, settled into the cracks, made everything feel slightly unclean. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to keep her breathing steady. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She was supposed to be home right now, probably in the shower, washing off the sweat from her morning run, already mentally preparing for another grueling day at school. Not here. Not this. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her hoodie as she curled in on herself, replaying everything in her head, the flashing lights, the voice barking at her to stop, the weight of the cuffs snapping around her wrists, the smug, satisfied look on Linda Pierce's face, as if she had won something. A bitter taste crept up the back of Emma's throat. She swallowed hard, forcing it down. The door creaked open, and she tensed, pressing her lips together in a tight line as a figure leaned lazily against the frame. Officer Calloway. He looked exactly like the type of guy who got a kick out of moments like this. Late 40s, thick around the middle, a mustache that didn't quite hide his perpetual smirk. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, like he didn't care enough to smooth it out before starting his shift. And the way he looked at her, casual, unimpressed, made her skin crawl. Next time, he drawled, arms crossing over his chest, maybe don't run through private neighborhoods like you own the place. Emma felt her jaw tighten. There it was again, that same smug, patronizing tone Linda had used when she declared that Oak Ridge Estates no longer had public roads. The same quiet, passive authority that people used when they knew they wouldn't suffer the consequences. Her fingers twitched. Every part of her wanted to snap back, to spit something sharp and furious that would wipe that smirk off his face. But she knew better. She had spent her entire life knowing better. So instead, she lifted her chin just a fraction. Can I make my call now? Calloway's smirk widened like she had just told a joke. Knock yourself out. He jerked his head toward the phone mounted on the wall, and Emma forced herself to stand, her legs stiff and shaky as she made her way across the small cell. She picked up the receiver with trembling fingers, exhaling slowly before punching in the number. Each ring felt like an eternity. 1, 2, 3. Hello? Her mother's voice sharp, controlled, but there was something else beneath it, something so tightly wound that Emma felt the hairs on her arms rise. She opened her mouth, but suddenly, the words felt foreign, too big to say out loud. But there was no way around it. Mom! Her voice was too soft, too weak. She swallowed, tried again. Dad! I was arrested. Silence. The kind that stretched too long, too still, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then finally, her father spoke. His voice was calm, too calm, low and measured, like a knife sliding out of its sheath. Who arrested you? Emma's fingers clenched around the receiver. HOA called the cops. They said I was trespassing, Dad. They put me in cuffs. Click. The line went dead. Emma sucked in a sharp breath, staring at the receiver as the dial tone buzzed in her ear. He had hung up. Not in anger, not in panic, but because he was already moving. Judge Malcolm Carter was on his way. When Judge Malcolm Carter walked into the police station, the entire room seemed to shift. The air, once filled with casual chatter, the hum of phones and the clatter of keyboards, went deathly still. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Officers who had been slouched in their chairs suddenly straightened. A few exchanged wary glances. He didn't need an introduction, he didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. At 6 feet 3 inches, broad-shouldered, a suit so sharp it could cut through steel, he moved with the measured, deliberate confidence of a man who had spent decades holding people's lives in his hands and making decisions that sent them away for the rest of theirs. He had sentenced murderers, shattered corrupt empires, and dismantled white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. He wasn't just a judge. He was the judge. The kind of man even powerful people feared. And right now, his focus was singular. Judge Malcolm Carter wasn't here as a neutral arbitrator of justice. He wasn't here to oversee a case or listen to weak justifications. He was here as a father, a furious father. The moment his polished dress shoes hit the linoleum floor, the room felt colder, tighter, as if the walls had shrunk just a little. Officer Calloway, who had been leaning lazily against the desk just minutes ago, suddenly looked like a man who had made a very, very bad decision. His cocky smirk faltered, his spine stiffening as Carter's gaze locked onto him. The kind of stare that made men sweat under oath. Calloway cleared his throat. "Can I help you, sir?" Carter didn't blink. Didn't move an inch. He simply stood there, a force of nature in a pristine suit. "My daughter," he said, his voice low and measured. "Where is she?" Calloway shifted uncomfortably. He had faced down rowdy drunks and street fights before, but this was different. This wasn't some angry citizen yelling about a parking ticket. This was a man who could end careers with a phone call. "We were just following HOA regulations," Calloway began, his voice wobbling slightly. "She was." Carter lifted a single finger. It was such a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a gavel slamming down. "Silence." Calloway's mouth snapped shut. The officers behind the desk barely breathed. Carter took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Tell me, officer," he said, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "What law, state or federal, allows an HOA to enforce criminal trespassing charges on a public road?" Calloway blinked. His throat bobbed. His mouth opened, then closed again. He darted a glance toward the other officers, as if silently pleading for backup. None of them moved. They knew better. Carter waited. 1 second. 2. 3. "That's what I thought," he said smoothly, straightening his cufflinks as if he had all the time in the world. "Now release her." "Immediately." Calloway hesitated. His face rapidly drained of color. But Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Now, just one word: cold. Final. The weight of it hung heavy in the air. Calloway exhaled sharply, then jerked his head at one of the younger officers standing nearby. "Get her out," he muttered. Within 5 minutes, the heavy metal door at the end of the hall groaned open. Emma stepped out. She looked smaller than usual, though she still held herself tall. Her hoodie was slightly wrinkled, her hands rubbing absently at her wrists where the cuffs had been, but her eyes were clear. Defiant. Carter's gaze softened just a fraction as he took in his daughter. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead in an unspoken reassurance. "Go wait in the car, sweetheart," he said, his voice even, steady. Emma hesitated for half a second, as if considering arguing, but she knew better. She knew that tone. She had heard it before when he shut down slick-talking defense attorneys, when he dismantled witnesses who thought they could lie on the stand, when he handed down sentences that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. It wasn't the voice of a man who had won. It was the voice of a man who was just getting started. So she gave a small nod and turned toward the door. And Malcolm Carter turned back to Calloway. The officer, now visibly sweating, tried to collect himself. "Look, Judge Carter, we were just..." "Sit down." Carter's mouth opened, then snapped shut when Carter tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting like a blade catching the light. Calloway sat. Carter smoothed down his tie, the gesture controlled and deliberate, before placing both hands on the desk in front of him. "Now," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Let's talk about exactly how many laws were broken tonight." Judge Carter turned to Calloway, his expression carved from stone. "Get me the HOA president, Linda Pierce, now." Calloway hesitated. He knew this was already spiraling out of control, knew that the situation had slipped through his fingers the moment Judge Carter walked through the door. But there was no arguing now, not with a man who wielded the law like a weapon. So, without another word, Calloway turned on his heel and disappeared down the hallway. Minutes passed, thick with tension. The other officers kept their heads down, pretending to focus on paperwork, avoiding Carter's gaze as if eye contact alone could pull them into whatever storm was about to unfold. The air in the room felt heavy, like the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Then, finally, the door swung open. Linda Pierce walked in with her usual smug confidence, her high heels clicking against the linoleum. She adjusted the lapels of her perfectly tailored blazer, her expression the same one she always wore at HOA meetings, stern, superior, utterly convinced of her own righteousness. She barely glanced at the officers. Her gaze went straight to Carter. Judge Carter, she said smoothly, folding her arms over her chest, I assume you understand that. I understand, Carter cut in, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. That you have overstepped your authority. Linda's lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the interruption. And Carter continued, his tone precise, methodical. I assume you're aware that filing a false police report is a felony? The shift in Linda's posture was almost imperceptible, a tightening around her shoulders, a flicker of hesitation in her carefully constructed expression. She licked her lips, glancing at Calloway as if he might somehow save her. He didn't. He was already sweating through his uniform, staring down at the desk as if he wished he could sink into it. I was acting in the best interest of our community, she finally said, straightening her spine, forcing a small, rehearsed smile. Carter tilted his head slightly, studying her like a scientist examining something under a microscope. Then, very calmly, he asked, by racially profiling a teenage girl? Linda flinched. The reaction was quick, involuntary. She recovered fast, too fast, but Carter saw it. That's not what this was about, she snapped, her voice rising just a fraction. It doesn't matter what you think it was about, Carter interrupted, his tone unchanged but the weight behind his words had. What matters is the law, and right now, Linda, you're on the wrong side of it. Linda's mouth opened, then shut again. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain. The reality was sinking in. The power dynamic had shifted, and she knew it. Carter let the silence stretch, watching as she struggled to come up with some excuse, some flimsy justification that would allow her to regain control of the situation. But there was none. Not this time. Here's what's going to happen, he said finally, his voice even, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. My daughter is pressing charges. I have every intention of ensuring this HOA is investigated for civil rights violations, and I will personally oversee the case that determines whether you, Linda Pierce, face criminal charges. Linda staggered back slightly, as if the words had physically struck her. Criminal charges? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter's lips curled into the faintest smirk. You should have read the fine print. By the next morning, the scandal had exploded like a grenade, shrapnel flying in every direction. The news cycle had latched onto it with the kind of voracious hunger reserved for political scandals and Hollywood meltdowns. Social media was on fire, the outrage spreading like gasoline on an open flame. HOA calls cops on jogging teen arrested without cause, federal judge takes legal action against corrupt HOA president, neighborhood racism exposed, Judge Carter strikes back. The headlines screamed from phone screens and television broadcasts. Twitter, no, X, was a war zone, flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForEmma and #HOAabuse. A local news station had already aired security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, capturing the exact moment Emma had been confronted by the police. The way she'd been forced to her knees. The way Linda Pierce had stood there, arms crossed, watching like she was the queen of some feudal court. The court of public opinion had already ruled, Linda was guilty. And now her phone wouldn't stop ringing. The HOA board members were in full panic mode, their once pristine, tightly controlled world crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. This is a nightmare, someone shrieked through the speaker of Linda's phone. Linda, standing in her once immaculate kitchen, barely acknowledged it. She was too busy stuffing clothes into a suitcase, her hands moving with stiff, jerky motions. Do you have any idea how much this lawsuit could cost us? Another board member demanded, his voice cracking with barely restrained hysteria. Linda clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to throw the phone across the room as if she hadn't spent the last 4 hours fielding panicked calls, as if she hadn't watched her reputation go up in flames overnight. The news vans had started circling her house before dawn, their bright cameras flashing through her windows like vultures eyeing fresh roadkill. A few reporters had even knocked on her door, their microphones shoved forward, waiting to capture a soundbite that might go viral. She had ignored them. Ignored the emails, the texts, the neighbors who had suddenly decided that she was the problem, that she had acted alone, that they hadn't nodded along in agreement every time she suggested tightening up security or keeping a certain standard in the neighborhood. Cowards. She zipped up the suitcase with a sharp jerk, her pulse hammering as she grabbed her laptop, shoving it into her tote bag. She could fix this. She just needed time. Time to spin the narrative, to get ahead of the media storm, to make people forget. Then her phone buzzed again. A new email. The subject line made her blood run cold. Emergency restraining order filed by Judge Malcolm Carter. For the first time in 24 hours, Linda felt her hands go completely still. She clicked on the email, scanning the document so fast the words blurred together. But the message was unmistakable. Judge Carter had wasted no time. By the power of an emergency injunction, she was now legally prohibited from stepping foot near his family, his property, or, most humiliating of all, the very neighborhood she had once ruled. She wasn't just facing a lawsuit. She was being erased. A sharp, bitter taste rose in her throat as she reached for her car keys, ignoring the calls still flooding her phone. It was over. And the worst part? She hadn't even seen the final blow coming. The HOA board was in full-blown crisis mode. The once powerful, immaculately organized group that had dictated every aspect of Oak Ridge Estates, from the shade of beige residents were allowed to paint their fences to the precise length of acceptable grass, was now scrambling like rats on a sinking ship. And it was sinking fast. News crews had set up shop outside the community's iron gates, eager to capture every second of the fallout. Furious residents flooded the HOA's inbox with emails demanding answers, while others were already consulting lawyers of their own, wondering if they too had grounds for lawsuits. The neighborhood's once pristine reputation had become a national joke, a cautionary tale of what happened when people let power go to their heads. The board members, men and women who had once lorded over the community with an iron fist, were now panicking, grasping for any way to salvage what little authority they had left. First, they issued a public apology. It was a carefully crafted statement filled with all the right buzzwords: regret, misunderstanding, a failure to communicate. They insisted that Oak Ridge Estates was a welcoming community, that the incident had been a deeply unfortunate mistake, that the HOA was taking steps to ensure something like this never happened again. No one bought it. The comments on the HOA's Facebook page were brutal. You didn't care until you got caught. You called the cops on a teenager, and now you want sympathy? Fire everyone. Dissolve the HOA. You're all a disgrace. The board, seeing the apology had flopped harder than a failed Kickstarter, switched tactics. They blamed Linda. It was her fault. They claimed she had acted alone. She had made the decision to call the police. She had misrepresented the HOA's policies. They painted her as a rogue agent, someone who had abused her position, someone they never would have supported had they only known. Again, no one bought it. Linda had been HOA president for years. She was the HOA. Every rule, every fine, every ridiculous regulation, they had all been crafted under her leadership. The idea that she had somehow acted alone was laughable. But the board members weren't done grasping at straws. So, they tried one more thing. They tried to buy their way out through a lawyer. They discreetly reached out to Judge Carter, offering a settlement. A very large settlement. Enough money to make the lawsuit disappear. To make all of this go away before it got any worse. Carter's response? A single sentence. No amount of money will buy your way out of this. The message was clear. They weren't dealing with a disgruntled homeowner who could be silenced with a check. They were dealing with a judge. One who had made a career out of holding people accountable. So, out of options and out of time, the board did the only thing they could: they fired Linda publicly. They announced her removal in an official statement, distanced themselves as far as humanly possible, and threw her under the bus with all the enthusiasm of people trying to save their own skin. But it was too late. The lawsuit had already been filed. The investigations had already begun. The damage was done, and nothing, not apologies, not lies, not even the ultimate sacrifice of their now former president, was going to stop what was coming next. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every aisle lined with reporters, legal analysts, and furious residents of Oak Ridge Estates, who had come to witness the downfall of the woman who had once ruled over them with an iron fist. The air was thick with murmurs, hushed whispers, and the quiet clicking of cameras capturing every movement, every flicker of emotion that passed across Linda Pierce's face. She sat at the defendant's table, her back unnaturally straight, but her hands betrayed her, clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The confident, smug woman who had once stood behind the police officers as they cuffed a teenage girl was gone. What remained was a shell of that person, visibly shaken, pale, and exhausted from weeks of legal battles and public humiliation. She had fought. She had spent the last month trying everything: appeals, statements, last-ditch efforts to shift the blame onto anyone else. She had begged the HOA for legal support, only to find that they had abandoned her the moment she was no longer useful to them. She had watched her name get dragged through every major news outlet. Had seen her house vandalized. Had felt the weight of public outrage crush the life she had spent years carefully curating. And now, all that remained was this moment. The moment where the final nail would be driven into the coffin of her reputation, her career, her very existence as she had known it. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Malcolm Carter sat behind the towering wooden bench. His black robe crisp, his expression unreadable. He looked down at her, his gaze steady, his presence suffocating in its authority. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Linda swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, like sandpaper. The words barely made it past her lips. "Yes, Your Honor." A pause. The room felt impossibly silent, the weight of expectation pressing down on everyone inside. "And do you realize that your actions resulted in unlawful detainment and racial profiling?" A ripple of tension passed through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Linda's lips trembled. Her eyes darted toward her lawyer, but he gave no indication that he could save her now. She was on her own. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't mean." Carter didn't blink. "Intent does not absolve guilt." The words were final, cold. A legal truth delivered without room for debate. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the courtroom. Linda let out a quiet, shuddering breath, shoulders slumping under the weight of it all. Then Judge Carter reached for the gavel. He lifted it with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout the entire trial. A second passed. Then another. And then, crack. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Guilty. The word might as well have been branded onto Linda's forehead. It rang in her ears louder than anything she had ever heard. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom, the moment sinking in like a stone dropping into deep water. It was over. Linda Pierce was no longer the queen of Oak Ridge Estates. She was just another name in the system, another disgraced official brought down by her own arrogance. And there was no HOA rule in the world that could save her now. Linda Pierce resigned from the HOA that same day, not that she had much of a choice. The board meeting where her fate was decided lasted less than 15 minutes. There was no debate, no impassioned speeches in her defense. Just a cold, clinical execution of what everyone already knew was inevitable. The very people who had once followed her orders without hesitation, who had enforced her ridiculous fines, who had nodded along in agreement when she suggested banning certain types of residents, had now turned their backs on her completely. It was almost poetic. Her resignation letter was short, devoid of any remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Effective immediately, I resign from my position as president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I will have no further involvement with the organization or its affairs. No apology. No explanation. Just a quiet, pitiful retreat. She had built this neighborhood's identity from the ground up, shaping it into what she considered the perfect community. A place where she decided the rules. Where she controlled who fit in and who didn't. And now she was nothing. She packed up what little she had left, leaving behind the house she had once lorded over with an iron fist. It didn't feel like home anymore, not with the whispers from neighbors who now refused to meet her gaze, not with the threats of more lawsuits looming over her like a storm cloud. But Linda's downfall was only the beginning. The residents of Oak Ridge Estates weren't done reclaiming their community. The very next week, the HOA board, scrambling to contain the damage, called for a vote on whether the association should continue to exist at all. What had once been the unshakable foundation of their neighborhood was now a toxic brand. An institution so tainted by scandal that even its most loyal supporters wanted nothing to do with it. When the final votes were counted, the numbers were staggering. 87% of homeowners voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. It was over. The iron-fisted rule of Oak Ridge Estates had officially come to an end, and the changes were immediate. The first thing to go? The absurdly strict property regulations that had once dictated everything from the length of grass to the precise shade of beige allowed for front doors. Almost overnight, the neighborhood came alive with rebellion. Homeowners painted their shutters vibrant colors just because they could. Driveways that had once been empty, because the HOA had banned parking in them, were suddenly filled with cars. Lawn ornaments, seasonal decorations, and porch swings appeared as if by magic, turning the once uniform community into something with actual personality. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates didn't feel like a gated kingdom. It felt like a neighborhood. As for Emma, she went back to jogging just like she always had. But this time, it was different. There was no more anxiety prickling at the back of her neck. No more second-guessing whether she belonged. No more need to brace herself for flashing red and blue lights or the sharp bark of an officer demanding she explain why she was existing in a place she had every right to be. She ran freely. Her stride strong, the crisp morning air filling her lungs as she moved effortlessly through the streets that had once felt like a battlefield. And then one morning, she rounded the cul-de-sac and slowed to a stop. The HOA office, once the most powerful building in the entire neighborhood, stood eerily silent. The sign had been taken down. The windows were dark. The parking lot was empty. For years, this had been their fortress, the place where they had held their meetings, where they had dictated who was and wasn't acceptable in Oak Ridge Estates. Now, it was nothing more than an abandoned shell of a failed regime. Emma stood there for a moment, hands on her hips, her breath still steady from the run. Then slowly, a smirk spread across her lips. She tilted her head, exhaled, and muttered, just loud enough for the wind to carry it away. "Guess I own the place."